Ashes of Creation gives the impression of being the most ambitious MMO of the last decade, but also one of the most chaotic in terms of development. Almost a case study of how big dreams and technical reality are in constant collision. It's that project which, even today in 2025 with Alpha 2 underway and early access announced for Steam, still feels more like a grand, mutating promise than a product with fully clear contours. One thing that stands out is how much the studio has embraced open development, with monthly live streams, showcases of classes, systems, art, and even a public timeline tracking the evolution. This creates a strong connection with the community, but it also amplifies every delay, every change of plan, and every potential cut, because everything immediately becomes public discourse. It's impossible to look at the context of Ashes without feeling a certain weariness with the cycle of postponements. Kickstarter in 2017, years of pre-alpha, Alpha 1, then Alpha 2 in phases, each with goals, wipes, and date changes. Phase 2 and 3 of Alpha 2 have been pushed back more than once, with test extensions and window changes, fueling the Ashes of Copium meme in the community and that classic doubt. Is this train really going to arrive at the station? At the same time, you can't say the game is stagnant. Today the project is in an advanced stage of Alpha 2, with 8 basic playable archetypes, core loops present, and a declared focus on moving from the foundation phase to content production at scale. The feeling is that the MMO's skeleton is there: combat, nodes, economy, infrastructure, but it lacks a lot of flesh in terms of biomes, quests, dungeons, and enough activities to keep a community engaged for years. At this point, with early access announced for December 11th, 2025 on Steam, it's clear that commercial pressure is also entering the scene, whether for cash flow or to maintain relevance before the hype completely wears off. When discussions start to emerge about beta in 2026, and the possibility of cutting or postponing content or features until after launch, it gives the impression that the project is trying to find a compromise between the gigantic vision and what is viable to release. The surrounding atmosphere of the game today is very mixed. On one side, a dedicated core that follows every dev update, defends the decisions, and believes in Steven Sharif's vision. On the other, people who are tired of promises, shifting windows, and fear that the final result won't match the time invested in following it. This polarization is almost inevitable in such long projects, but in the case of Ashes, it seems amplified precisely because the marketing has always sold the idea of the MMO that will fix everything others did wrong. Seeing only what has been shown so far, the personal impression is of a sincere, ambitious, and technically respectable project, but one that brutally underestimated the cost in time and focus.
For an MMO of this size, the expectation is that Ashes will indeed launch something interesting and different, but probably more contained than the original dream, with part of the vision being pushed back to post-launch, and the true verdict coming not on the day of early access, but a year or two later, when it's possible to see if the ecosystem of nodes, politics, and PvP truly sustains itself day to day.
The story of Ashes of Creation, based on what has been released so far, presents a rich and intriguing plot, focused on divine conflict and its consequences for the world of Vera. The narrative begins with the world's creation by a pantheon of 10 gods, who spawned a powerful race called the Ancients. This race ended up being banished along with the others, 3 rebel gods, in a celestial battle that shaped the cosmos. This mystical origin brings an epic and mythological tone to the MMORPG, which caught my attention due to its ambition in building a universe with its own depth. What seems truly captivating is the development of the story in 3 main acts: the creation, the fall, and the return. After the fall of the Ancients, a new era arises with 4 main races: humans, elves, dwarves, and orcs, who prosper but face corruption brought by the exiled Ancients attempting to regain control. This cycle of creation, fall, and rebirth is present in many fantasy narratives, but Ashes of Creation seems to try to bring greater complexity by allowing players to be an active part of this constantly changing story, which for me is a very promising aspect. The part that touches most on my personal interest is the idea of the divine gates that connect worlds, between Vera and Sanctus, a world without magic. Players come from Sanctus to return to Vera, which not only narratively links two planes, but creates a dynamic of adventure and reinvention of the worlds that can be fascinating to explore. This transition between worlds adds a layer of mystery and discovery, leaving me curious to see how this will be explored in the game in terms of gameplay and emergent narrative. On the other hand, the game's lore seems to be extremely dense, with many details about gods, the ancestors, corruption, different races, and cosmic events. This can be a double-edged sword. While it generates a rich universe for fans of deep history, it might deter casual players who prefer more direct and simple narratives. Personally, I think the developer will have the challenge of balancing this complexity so that the narrative doesn't become tiresome, maintaining immersion for all audiences. Another thing I perceive as very interesting is the aspect of the exodus of survivors to a new world, an event that creates natural hooks for quests, exploration, and social interaction. This seems like a great way to link the narrative to the MMORPG mechanics, where players can feel they are part of a living, constantly evolving story, reinforcing the feeling of belonging and impact within the game. Furthermore, the fact that the authors have created a setting where players' actions can shape the world shows a strong bet on emergent narrative. It's a concept I find quite engaging, as it puts the player at the center of the story and not simply as a passive spectator. This promise of a story that evolves with players and their choices is, in my view, the strongest differentiator of
Ashes of Creation, and could represent a unique experience in the MMORPG genre. Even without seeing the finished or fully delivered story, my impression is that Ashes of Creation has the potential to be an MMO with a large and multifaceted lore that combines original mythology with classic fantasy themes. I am cautiously optimistic, especially because what has been shown so far suggests that the game can offer an immersive and dynamic narrative experience, provided it manages to balance complex narrative with accessible and engaging gameplay.
The gameplay of Ashes of Creation, as far as has been shown, seems quite promising, mainly due to the sense of fluidity and the combination of hybrid combat between tab targeting and action. The system appears to deliver more dynamic combat than the traditional MMO, with abilities that can be activated while the character is moving, which is a relief and a positive point for those who like combat that isn't clunky or robotic. This, combined with well-done animations, gives a feeling of combat even more engaging than some genre classics. Another thing that draws attention is the progression system and the real impact of the player's actions on the world. The idea of nodes that evolve according to player activity creates a feeling that the world is alive and that your participation has a direct influence, which brings an interesting social and strategic aspect to the gameplay. This can lead to moments of gameplay that go beyond simply grinding mobs, making the environment more dynamic and interactive. However, some people who tested the alpha phases point out that the beginning can be a bit confusing, with certain problems with unclear quests and a learning curve that can frustrate novice players. This tends to be common in such complex and open games, where freedom sometimes presents challenges in guiding the player on what to do. Even so, the reward of progression, such as getting mounts and new abilities, seems to compensate for this initial discomfort. Crafting also plays a prominent role, with an apparently very robust system, but which some consider laborious and even tedious, especially in the early stages. However, this effort to manufacture items generates a greater feeling of accomplishment, as equipment is not simply obtained from random drops, bringing a difference for those who enjoy this type of mechanic. For crafting fans, this is a part that can prove quite satisfying in the long run. PvP, one of the most anticipated aspects, seems to be quite controversial so far. The system tries to balance those who want to avoid PvP with those seeking confrontations, even having optional immunity at lower levels. However, there are reports that large groups dominate certain events, which can impair the fun for solo players or small teams. It's a point that still needs adjustments to find a middle ground that pleases most. Visually, and in terms of setting, the game impresses with the beauty and attention to detail of the world, which appears to have a very dedicated hand in creating every corner of the map.
The immersion in this open world is one of the great attractions, with landscapes that truly invite exploration and communities that form with their own identity, a great differentiator for a modern MMO. Finally, for those who have only seen what has been released so far, Ashes of Creation seems like a game that tries to take the best of the past with innovation, delivering an MMO experience that appeals both to fans of more fluid combat,
Those of deep systems of social construction, crafting, and impact on the world. The game still has some rough edges to polish, especially at the beginning and in PvP, but it has a very interesting proposition for those who enjoy MMORPGs with ambition and innovation. The graphics of Ashes of Creation so far show a world that tries to mix realism with a fantastic touch, but is still far from becoming iconic. The game has grown quite a bit visually since the first teasers, but what we see today in preview videos and closed tests still looks a bit raw, especially when compared to major recently released titles like Black Desert Online or New World. The lighting stands out a lot, especially with the use of the Unreal 5 engine, which intuitively brings more immersive sensations of open environments, nights, and varied weather. On the other hand, there is a feeling that the scenarios still lack a solid visual identity, as if the game is trying to please many styles at the same time. The cities, forests, and fields presented so far are beautiful, but they don't make a unique impression. There is no instant wow upon seeing a scene, at least not like what happens in games like The Witcher 3 or Starfield. You can see the devs' effort in creating a dynamic world, but sometimes this effort ends up hindering the visual impact, especially in smaller or secondary areas. The animations, especially of the mounts, are well praised, and there is greater attention to details such as character expressions and movements. Even so, there are many visual effects overloading some scenes, which can be tiring during battles or mass explorations. The balance between particles and scene clarity has not yet been fully resolved, which can make it difficult to take certain group combat seriously. Going beyond the pure visual, the lingering feeling is that the game prioritizes world and interaction, but sacrifices a bit of the immediate impact of the graphics. The scenery can change according to the season, and there are attempts to bring unique elements such as giant crystals and colorful flowers, but there is still a lack of deeper dedication to textures and landscapes in such a way that the world truly feels inhabited and alive, not just pretty. What surprises me the most, however, is the potential. The visual has evolved, and there is clearly a team working so that each future testimonial shows a leap in quality. I don't doubt that, if the developers continue at this pace, Ashes of Creation could become a visual benchmark for MMORPGs, but it hasn't gotten there yet. What is more difficult to predict is whether the semi-realistic style will be maintained, or if they will bet on bolder fantasy, which could define how memorable the game will be in a few years. The visual of Ashes of Creation is promising, but still lacks a strong identity and sufficient refinement to stand out against competitors. What we see today is a solid structure, with fantastic roots, but still dependent on more adjustments to truly impress those looking for a beautiful and memorable virtual world. The performance of Ashes of Creation, considering what has been released so far, seems to be a topic full of ups and downs, which is common for an MMORPG still in the alpha testing and early access phase. The developer has been very transparent in allowing players to participate from very early stages, which shows a clear intention to improve the game with community feedback, but also reveals that the game is far from polished. This brings the expectation of performance that can still vary greatly, with bugs and instabilities typical of this phase. From what can be seen in recent analyses, the game features quality graphics and good animations, especially regarding the mounts, which are praised for visual fluidity. However, technical performance, including server stability, still has points to improve. Some updates and bug fixes have been constant, but the pace of improvements has frustrated part of the community, especially due to pending content and systems still under development, which impacts the overall player experience. Another point that caught my attention is the great technical challenge of an MMO with such massive interaction. Like thousands of active AI NPCs in dense areas,
which Ashes of Creation has already shown it can support in tests. This technical capability is a great indication for the future of the game, as it signals that it has the potential to run large events and epic moments without server collapse, a common problem in other MMOs. This makes me excited about the game's scalability, even if it still needs improvements. Speaking of requirements, it seems that Ashes of Creation demands a moderately powerful PC to run well, with recommendations focused on modern processors, 12GB to 16GB of RAM, and graphics cards at a level equivalent to the GTX 1070. The use of SSD is practically mandatory to avoid long loading times, which can be a challenge for players with older or limited hardware. This shows that the game is technically ambitious, which tends to be a dividing line between fluid performance and a frustrating experience depending on the player's machine. Regarding server stability and infrastructure to support a large number of simultaneous players, reports indicate that things are still being tested and improved. There were moments of drama in the community due to technical problems and persistent bugs, especially in tests that coincided with periods of temporary discounts, like year-end holidays, when the focus should have been on enjoying the game, but the servers did not cooperate. The hope is that the next versions and the early access launch on Steam will resolve much of this. Personally, what most draws my attention is the studio's effort to listen to player feedback and make adjustments based on it, such as changes to the crafting system to focus more on player interaction and less on repetitive farming, which brings more fluidity to the MMO and improves the overall experience. However, this early phase makes it clear that for those looking for a completely stable and complete game, Ashes of Creation is not bare yet. It's a journey that will build up over time with constant improvements. Ultimately, looking at what has been exposed, my opinion is that the performance of Ashes of Creation so far is a mix of impressive potential, with the typical growing pains of an MMO in development. The visual and technical scale set a very promising tone, but the player experience can be inconsistent, especially for those without patience or high-end hardware. For enthusiasts who enjoy participating in the development and feedback process, it's a unique opportunity. However, for those who want a finished and stable product, it's still better to wait a little longer. Buying Ashes of Creation at launch can be a risky bet, especially for those expecting a completely polished product packed with content from day one. The game still has several gaps in its content offering, and some important systems still seem to be under development, which can impact the initial experience, especially for players who don't like facing periods of constant adjustment and evolution. This feeling of sandbox without sand, where the potential is there, but the content is scarce, has been mentioned by several players in recent tests, indicating that the game is more of a promise than an experience ready for immediate consumption. The complexity of the class system and the detailed level of customization are exciting points for those who enjoy deep MMORPGs. With 8 main archetypes and 64 class combinations, the game promises a diversity and flexibility that can provide a truly personal experience. This breadth is one of the aspects that generates anticipation for the future, but which still needs to be fully explored, as the game is still in an initial stage of implementing these systems. However, the progress so far in the alpha phases has been uneven for many players. There have been visual advancements and improvements in some game dynamics, such as the quest system, but there are still many bugs, lack of content, and systems that need refinement. Some players mention that the endgame and the PvP aspect are lacking in terms of motivation, in addition to the community experiencing a toxicity that can be discouraging for newcomers. In other words, the social and game experience is not yet mature. If you are looking for an MMORPG with an already well-formed community, full of content to progress through, and that works in a more stable and balanced way, now is not the ideal time to jump in. For enthusiasts who like to follow game development and are willing to invest time and patience to help shape the game with feedback, participating in tests, and conveniently accepting the pre-alpha or early access state, it might even be worth it. But for those who prefer a polished and ready experience, it might be better to wait for future updates.
Those who enjoy open-world elements with a dynamic political system, a robust economy, and an environment where their actions directly impact the evolution of the world will find an intriguing promise in Ashes of Creation. For fans of traditional MMORPGs who enjoy building, dominating territories, and interacting intensely with PvP and PvE systems, the game presents itself as an interesting possibility, but one that still depends on the developer's continuous work to reach its full potential. In summary, the decision to buy Ashes of Creation now at launch depends heavily on the player's profile. If you like unpredictable novelty, are willing to deal with bugs and incomplete systems, and intend to follow the game's evolution, it's worth a try. However, if your expectation is for a robust, ready,
and competent MMORPG from the start, waiting is safer. My personal impression, looking only at what has been released, is that the game is far from being a complete experience right now, and may frustrate more than please immediate players. Therefore, for many, Ashes of Creation is an exciting project, but for a definitive purchase at launch, my advice is caution. Take the time to follow community feedback, see future updates and releases before fully committing, as this game is still more of a separate development journey than a finalized delivery.